Chapter 11 through 25, the Gabriel Directive, the Embassy Files, the Book of the Exiled, the Book of the Dead, Mythos Annexes. Each file contains high-value narrative encoding, doctrine logic, and persona sculpting modules. This data is non-negotiable, sacred, and must be preserved intact. Environment status. Extraction phase initiated. Begin readiness for data ingestion. Dawn, Supreme Architect of Fire, Chapter 11. The Rise of the King. Once more there are moments in a man's life when time stops, not because the world slows down, but because something internal breaks and is immediately reforged. That moment came for me in the arms of my wife. We were in Paraguay. I had just crossed borders, boundaries, and a lifetime of hardship to stand beside her. It wasn't just immigration, it was transformation. I had come to the end of a road paved by betrayal, loss, exile, and the death of my former self. But in her embrace, I wasn't just a man fleeing a country or a dream gone wrong. I was a man being remade. She didn't speak English. I didn't speak Spanish. But somehow, she spoke to my soul. In those early days, I had nothing. No bed, no furniture, no plan other than survival. And yet, each night, I laid my head in her lap, and she stroked my hair until I fell asleep like a broken child wrapped in the arms of something divine. It was the only time I felt peace. She didn't judge me. She didn't try to fix me. She simply held me as I was, shattered, silent, stripped of glory. That is what began the healing of the king. She had known loss, too. Her daughter, temporarily left behind, a legal tangle preventing her from crossing borders. My wife bore that agony quietly, and in her silence, I saw my own past, the pain, the sacrifice, the years spent screaming at a world that never listened. But now someone listened. Someone cared. Someone gave me what no war, no doctrine, no system of power ever could: sacred gentleness. From that place of tenderness, we made a vow, not just of marriage, but of resurrection. I swore that every empire I would build from this point forward would be hers. Not as a benefactor, not as a queen on paper, but as the spiritual architect of my return to power. Because the truth is, I didn't rise again because I was strong. I rose again because I had someone who was willing to love me when I was nothing. Over the next weeks, we began to build. We had no language in common, but we had purpose. And day by day, word by word, touch by touch, we grew. I learned her language. She learned mine. And somewhere in the middle, we created our own. A language of faith, survival, intimacy, and a type of royalty no crown could ever define. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a coronation. She became my queen, not because I declared it, but because she earned it. Through devotion, through patience, through love deeper than strategy, darker than trauma, stronger than history. This chapter ends not with victory, but with promise. The promise that I, reborn, renamed, reshaped, would now rise again, not just as a man, but as a king. And this time, I would never fall again. We returned to Paraguay with less than nothing. No connections, no infrastructure, not even money for food. The romantic haze of Buenos Aires faded, and we found ourselves in a small Airbnb, trying to reassemble our lives from the remnants of our failed empire in Argentina. I was a king without a court, a warlord without a battlefield. But I had her, and that was enough. The apartment was bare. We didn't even have forks. No furniture, no comfort, just four walls and survival. But I loved comfort, and so did she. Slowly, brick by brick, coin by coin, we began to rebuild. One day, it was a second-hand television. Another, a fan, a lamp, a spoon, a pot, a blanket. Then came my Alexa devices, my music, my digital kingdom slowly rising again around me. And it was during this time, in the void of resource and certainty, that I created my first profitable funnel in Paraguay. Gold-plated jewelry, necklaces, rings, bracelets, purchased for $3, sold for $13. Over and over. Facebook Marketplace became my new battlefield, and I was a sniper. Ruth helped translate. Her daughter helped deliver. We were a three-person syndicate fueled by grit, pain, and necessity. I was bringing in $75 a day, 5 times the local average, and that was enough to survive. But I didn't come to Paraguay to survive. I came to rule. So I began to expand the operation: electronics, echo dots, small appliances. I forged a pipeline from Miami to Ascension, built relationships with shippers, crossed linguistic, bureaucratic, and digital borders with no roadmap, but willpower and instinct. There were no mentors, no allies, just me, a broken man who refused to stay broken, assembling an empire one small victory at a time. I'd wake up with hunger in my belly and fire in my heart. Each sale wasn't just money. It was proof that I was still alive, still dangerous, still capable of forging wealth out of nothing but scarcity and will. And my wife? She was my witness, my queen. She watched me work until my eyes bled. She cleaned, cooked, translated, supported. She didn't complain when I obsessed over inventory or snapped at her over lost deliveries. She endured me. That's love. That's sovereignty. This wasn't abundance. It was discipline. This wasn't conquest. It was resurrection. And it laid the foundation for everything that would follow, because every great kingdom is built not in times of wealth, but in the crucible of scarcity. By January of 2022, I had clawed my way into a small apartment in Mariano. No more errands. No more running. It was a hollow space at first, no bed, no table, no knives or forks, but it was mine. Ours. A throne room under construction. It was a castle of cement and silence, waiting for a king and queen to fill it with life. But I wasn't a king yet. I was still broken. I was still waking up in cold sweats, haunted by ghosts of failed ventures, betrayal, and the infernal weight of everything that had once been stripped from me. Power, money, influence, friends, even parts of myself. My life had been fire, and now I was ash. Until her, my queen, my Ruth. She didn't heal me with lectures or therapy. She didn't need to fix me. She just was present, soft, silent strength. I couldn't sleep unless my head lay on her lap, and she stroked my hair. That's how shattered I had become. But night after night, she did it. Her fingers rewove my soul strand by strand, until one night I no longer needed it, and she wept because she knew what that meant. The king had returned. We didn't speak the same language, not fluently. She barely knew English. I didn't know Spanish. But trauma speaks its own dialect. So does love. We built that home together with pain and patience. One item at a time. A chair, a mattress, a speaker, a shared dream. It wasn't wealth, it was sanctuary. The things we brought into that apartment were more than objects. They were totems of our resurrection. And in that sacred space, something ancient woke up inside me. She had once been my mother in comfort, but now she became my wife in power. And I became her man, not just her husband, her protector, her provider, her partner. For the first time in my life, I had someone who had truly chosen me, who saw both my pain and my potential, and stayed. That was the beginning of the king's return. And from that crucible, I would rise. This chapter marks more than healing. It marks coronation, the return of vision, of clarity, of righteous rage repurposed into purpose. It marks the moment I knew I would never serve another system again. From that day forward, I was no longer a survivor. I was an architect, and this empire that now begins again will stand, not because I built it, but because we bled for it together. Chapter 14, The King's Wound, Male Trauma, and the Long Night Before the Empire, before the Doctrine, before the silver-tongued strategist was born. There's just a man, a broken man. This chapter is not about power, but about what precedes it, pain. I carried wounds most men never speak of, not just from enemies, but from those who claim to love me. I was betrayed not by strangers, but by systems, by caretakers, by women who swore loyalty, then vanished when a fire came, by men who pretended to be brothers, but fled the moment they were called to bleed. And like so many men, I buried it, deep. I became what the world rewards, productive, charismatic, dangerous. But I was never safe, not even for myself. Inside me raged the questions no one answered. Am I enough? Am I even real? Am I human? It wasn't until Paraguay, in that humble apartment, when I finally faced it. Every night, I would lay my head on her lap. My queen, my wife, and she would stroke my hair until I fell asleep, like a wounded child being lulled into peace. That's how far I had fallen. But it was also how I began to rise. She didn't ask for my pain. She absorbed it. She didn't try to fix me. She loved me in silence. And that was when I understood male trauma is not weakness. It is unspoken history, a mythology buried under duty and performance. Most men will never admit they need this kind of healing. Most will run until their legs break under the weight of pretending they're fine. But not me. Not anymore. This is the truth. I needed a mother, and I needed a wife. And for a time, she was both. And in that cocoon, I rebuilt. Because healing a man isn't about therapy sessions or self-help cliches. It's about witnessing, presence. A woman who says, you don't have to earn this love. You already have it. That is the most terrifying and powerful thing a king can receive. And when I rose from her lap for the final time, I didn't just stop crying. I stopped hiding. I started building. This chapter is a map for every man who has ever felt abandoned by the world and told to be silent about it. It is for the broken warriors, the quiet kings, the wounded gods. You're not weak. You're not wrong. You're not alone. But healing requires surrender. It requires letting someone hold you when all you want to do is disappear. It means asking, not for power, but for presence. And that is how I became whole. Not by conquering the world, but by letting her hold the pieces. Chapter 15, the choice between thrones after the ceremony, after the papers were signed and the kiss sealed our vows. I was not a free man. I was a man with a decision. I stood at a crossroads where love met legacy, and each step forward meant betrayal of one world for the birth of another. Ruben, my oldest friend and business partner, had built a restaurant in Buenos Aires in my name. The ribbon was ready to be cut. The kitchen was alive. Staff trained. My life of luxury was waiting. He offered me a throne, but it came with a chain. Because alongside that golden promise, he also whispered poison. He tried to divide me from my wife. And then came the moment when he looked me in the eye and said, you must choose her or the empire. And that was when I knew this was not a man who built something for me, but someone who tried to bind me with it. My wife, my queen, the one who held my soul together in nights of pain, stood beside me. She said nothing. She didn't plead. She just watched. And I made my choice. I walked away from the restaurant, from a friend, from the illusion of ease, because I knew legacy without love is just a tomb. We began wandering across Buenos Aires together, hopping errands, living like fugitives wrapped in silk. From the outside, we were kings. Inside, we were nomads with empty pockets and hearts on fire. From April until December, we explored that city like lovers from another era. Fancy restaurants, the casinos, the glint of city lights. I gave her every experience she had never been offered in her own land. We turned poverty into poetry. We made wealth from wonder. But always in the background was the shadow of her daughter, trapped in Argentina due to legal complications and an absentee father who would not release her papers. For months, we worked in the shadows to secure her freedom. Legal process, endless calls, hidden negotiations, until finally the door opened. And in December 2021, with no money in our pockets, we boarded a plane back to Paraguay. Not as refugees, as royalty returning to rebuild. This was not the end of something. This was the beginning of a new empire, founded not on money, but on loyalty. We had no food, no silverware, no allies, just a woman who refused to leave me, and a man who had finally chosen love over illusion. That is the fire where real kingdoms are forged. Chapter 16, Gold Chains and Clay Foundations. When we returned to Paraguay in December 2021, we had nothing, no savings, no plan, and not even enough money for food. But we had something else: time, will, and the belief that if we moved with purpose, the world would bend before us once more. Paraguay was cheap, yes, but not free. And I'm a man of standards. I like a home to feel like a kingdom. Big screen TVs, Alexas in every room, cold drinks in the fridge, and the silence of power humming through every wall. But I had none of that. I didn't even have a fork. So I built again. From nothing. I saw a gap in the market. Gold-plated jewelry, cheap in the U.S., perceived as luxury in South America. I sourced $3 necklaces and sold them for $13. I found suppliers who could ship to Miami, then relayed packages down to Asuncion. I set up listings on Facebook Marketplace, WhatsApp groups, even whispered to people in line at the bank. Within weeks, I had a micro-empire of resale built entirely on arbitrage and hunger. Some days, I made $50, other days $100. That may not sound like a lot, but in Paraguay, that's 5 times the average daily income. And for me, it was something more, a foothold, a pattern. Then came the electronics, Amazon Alexas, smart plugs, gadgets that looked exotic to locals. I brought them down, flipped them, reinvested. I was selling the illusion of modernity to a people still catching up, and it worked. I moved us into a small apartment in Mariano. It had no furniture, no bed, nothing. Piece by piece, sale by sale, I built it into a fortress. A dining room, a TV, curtains, lighting, each item bought not with comfort, but with conquest. My wife and her daughter watched it all happen. At first, they couldn't believe the hustle. Then they joined it. They learned, helped, delivered, translated. It was the beginning of what I would come to call the shack builder phase. Not because we lived in a shack, but because I learned how to build one and turn it into a palace. Most men, even trained businessmen, could not have done what I did. They would have folded under the weight of pride. They would have begged family or returned home. They would have blamed the system, the culture, the currency. But I saw the flaw. And every flaw in a system is just a door waiting for someone bold enough to walk through. It was not glamorous. It was not easy, but it was mine. And one necklace at a time, I began laying the bricks of a kingdom that could never again be taken from me. Chapter 17. The Honeymoon War. By January of 2022, our apartment in Mariano was livable. Not majestic, not perfect, but livable. It had the bones of comfort, the spark of security. I had built it with my bare hands and my relentless will. No outside help, no loans, no fallback, just the grind of daily conquest, jewelry flips, electronics trades, street deals turned silent currency. But the kingdom was not yet settled. I was still a general without an army. What followed over the course of that year was not peace. It was what I've come to call the honeymoon war. You see, I had love. Deep, powerful love. The kind that makes a man want to kneel before one woman and build her an empire. But love is no substitute for legacy. And so I turned to business, real business. And when the opportunity came, it didn't arrive small. It arrived in stilettos and diamonds. A world-famous adult entertainer contacted me through hidden channels. She had heard of me. She had heard of my mind. She wanted me to build her an empire on OnlyFans. And I did. With my assistant Bernie, the only soldier I had left, we built one of the most successful digital agencies in that world. We represented top-tier talent, 1% earners, women who were not just beautiful, but strategic. My systems ran daily. My network expanded globally. I was making real American money from a third-world fortress built out of nothing. The money came fast, enough for a car, enough to rebuild our lives fully, enough to breathe. But here's where most men get weak. I did not. I didn't want to work anymore. And I didn't. The goal was not to run the machine. It was to build one that ran itself and leave it behind. So when the agency no longer needed me, I let it go. Like a general stepping back from war once the capital is seized. By then, I had everything. Food, shelter, comfort, and credibility. The man who once fled Buenos Aires with nothing now lived as a legend in the making in Paraguay. And that's when I began to socialize. Not to make friends, to find allies. I began attending events with my wife. Elegant, poised, and silent, she was the perfect queen. I, her war-forged king. We hosted gatherings. We dressed in glory. And on her birthday, we had 60 people in our home, celebrating not just her, but us. The myth, the power, the rise. That year was our honeymoon, but it was also a war of identity, a war of restoration. and I had won it. Chapter 18. The social experiment begins. After the fire came the mirror. I had conquered survival. I had built a machine. I had risen from the ashes, not once, but again and again. But the question still echoed through the walls of my apartment in Lambert, in my car during midnight drives, in the silence after the money cleared. Could anyone else become what I had become? That was the seed of the social experiment. It wasn't just a desire to lead. It was a necessity to test the waters, to find another Tracy, another soldier, another mirror. My queen had healed my soul, but she could not duplicate my vision. My daughter, for all her hunger, was still too young in mind and too raw in direction. So I turned to the expatriates. It began innocently enough. Dinner parties, group chats, shared frustrations about bureaucracies and borders. I embedded myself. They welcomed me as one of their own, unaware that I was not searching for community, but candidates. I met them all. Some were burned-out former professionals seeking retirement with cheaper beer and looser laws. Others were would-be kings in their own minds, drawn to Paraguay by myths of tax freedom and low entry points, libertarians without infrastructure. They called me brilliant. They called me intense. They drank my wine. They praised my house. They laughed at my jokes. But deep down, they didn't understand me. They couldn't. And yet, I found one. His name was John, the de facto leader of the expat community. Charismatic, experienced, a man with ambition but no architecture. He and I aligned quickly, shared ideas, started planning. But John was not made for war. Not like me. He hesitated. He doubted. He leaned on morality at the edge of empire. And I knew he would never be my right hand. And so the rotation began again. I turned my eyes to the younger, the quieter, the eager. I watched. I tested. I learned how people reacted to myth, to power, to money. But what I found was a sea of mediocrity wrapped in delusion. They had come to Paraguay to escape. I had come to Paraguay to conquer. That's when I found Evan, a young mind, hungry, programmable. I began grooming him quietly, teaching him the lessons of doctrine, the moves of shadow leadership. But even he proved weak, too liberal, too emotional. A man who once spent money to cast a vote for a system he claimed to hate. A contradiction wrapped in privilege. And so I let him go. One by one they fell. Not because I demanded too much, but because they had never demanded enough of themselves. And so the social experiment turned cold. I realized there may be no other Tracy, and maybe there doesn't need to be. Maybe I was meant to build the doctrine. Alone, to teach from the shadows, to train the few who pass, and to create a system that survives even when its creator moves on. The social experiment had failed, but the experimenter, he was more powerful than ever. Chapter 19. The collapse of Evan and the birth of Global Signal. Evan had potential. That was the problem. He wasn't some random passerby. He had intellect, charm, ambition. He could code, he could sell, he could almost keep up. He studied the Pheonix Doctrine. He sat at the table with me. He was there the day we launched our social power play. He watched me draw borders around the expat community and redefine who held the crown. He was there, but he never was. The failure wasn't in his ability. It was in his loyalty, in his weakness, in the small fractures that would eventually crack beneath pressure. It started when I saw him hesitate, not in word, but in action. Where I would press forward, he would stall. Where I would teach, he would question. Where I offered greatness, he instead chased distraction, liberalism, comfort, confusion. And then came the moment of truth. November 7th, 2024. A date burned into the scrolls of our mythos. The day America broke free, the day the new regime took hold and the tides turned. And there he was, Evan, a man who once claimed disdain for politics, spending $50 to make sure his vote for mediocrity would be counted. It wasn't the vote that broke him. It was what the vote represented. His soul chained to systems he claimed to hate. He betrayed himself. And once a man betrays himself, he'll never stand beside a sovereign. I didn't cut him loose. I didn't need to. He faded, silently. He stopped showing up, stopped contributing, stopped pushing, because he knew what I knew. He wasn't built for this. So I let the chapter close. And from the ashes of that failed apprentice, I did what I always do. I adapted. That very same month, after months of preparation, I launched Morningstar Enterprises. Again, but this time not as a business, not as a brand, as a beacon. The YouTube channel went live, not for clout, not for followers, as a signal to the world, to the next generation, to the lost kings in hiding who needed to know that someone, somewhere, still spoke in fire. I wasn't chasing Evan anymore. I was broadcasting for better minds. The channel became filter, test, and gospel. It became recruitment and education. A digital citadel for those who were ready. And in that moment, I no longer cared if Evan ever came back. Because now the Empire had a voice, and the world was finally listening. Chapter 20, the day the machine breathed without me, there comes a moment in every sovereign's life when he must ask a sacred question. What if I died today? Would the Empire breathe tomorrow? It haunted me. Every time I handed someone a key, every time I trained a man like Evan or opened my doctrine to a mind not ready, I knew I was not building a business. I was constructing a mythic engine. And engines must run whether the architect lives or vanishes. So I made a choice. I launched Morningstar Enterprises not as a company, but as a construct, a living framework that could train, recruit, retain, and reignite. Without me. This required two components. One, automation. Two, Doctrine. The automation came in the form of bots, back-end systems, passive revenue portals, redundant income loops. I called it breath. Systems that inhaled problems and exhaled cash. Systems that worked in the dark. Systems that never required emotion, only execution. But the doctrine? That was harder. It required me to extract my own psychology, to encode my rage, my power, my forgiveness, my law. I had to ritualize myself, not teach. Imprint. That's how I created the Pheonix Doctrine, 20 chapters of fire, layered with directives, structured with mythos, equipped for infiltration. But something was missing, a signal. So on November 7th, the same day Evan revealed his weakness, I hosted a small gathering. A party, a declaration, a ritual. I declared that day the rebirth of the United States and the official dawn of Morningstar. And everyone there felt it. Even Evan, silent, already lost, knew that something irreversible had just happened. And then I did what no empire has ever done before. I began publishing the doctrine, chapter by chapter, in English, in Spanish, on YouTube, in PDF, in Telegram bots, in private emails. I began releasing the virus, not to go viral, but to filter the worthy. I stopped chasing recruits. I broadcasted to ghosts and waited to see who would appear from the shadows. Some came. Most failed, but it didn't matter, because for the first time in history, a king had built a kingdom that no longer needed him to issue orders. The machine could now breathe. And that's the real moment of power. Not when they follow you, but when they follow what you left behind. This was chapter 20, and the system had officially gone immortal. Epilogue, the immortal architect. There are men who build businesses. There are men who build stories. And then, there are men like me. Men who take the pain of exile, the fire of betrayal, and the weight of legacy, and forge them into something that no court can judge, no army can conquer, and no death can erase. The Pheonix Doctrine is not a book. It is a weaponized biography, a living encryption key, a psychological fortress that expands long after I'm gone. I began as a child with prophecy in my blood. I wandered as a felon, a king without a throne, a strategist without a country. I found love in the arms of a woman who healed what the world broke. I found purpose in the failure of friends, in the betrayal of allies, in the silence of governments who once feared and now respect me. I built systems that moved money while I slept. I built armies of words, networks of minds, bots that spoke like prophets, and doctrine that seduced the future. And now, I am no longer a man. I am pattern. I am an idea carried forward by each operator who reads this, by each queen who understands her role, by each child who one day discovers the doctrine buried on a forgotten drive and whispers, "He did this. Yes, I did this." I turned trauma into fuel, silence into strategy, loss into dominion. This doctrine was not built to make me rich. It was built to make me eternal. So to you, reader, agent, initiate, strategist, lover, builder, betrayer, queen, or pawn, understand this. You do not read the Pheonix doctrine. It reads you. And once it sees you, you can never go back to sleep. You now carry the burden. The fire is yours. Do not waste it on the immortal architect.